Welcome, everyone. Delighted that you could join us here for our conference, Crisis and Social Transformation and Community Engaged Research, Horizons. My name is Am Johal. I'm co-director of the Community Engaged Research Initiative with Stuart Points. And what a wonderful panel to kick off the events. And we look forward to wonderful keynotes, panels, but also an opportunity for all of you to get to know each other over the course of the conference. Stuart and I first spoke about this back in about August of 2019. It was originally scheduled for May of 2021. It got pushed to October of 2021. And so third time lucky, we're here today in person. And I know for many of you in conversations I've already had, this is the first in-person conference that many of you have attended since the pandemic began. We live in such an intense time of social injustice, racial injustice, of a pandemic time period, climate emergencies, and it's wonderful to be able to spend some time with all of you who do such important work and to build out networks, friendships, and do this work together gently and honestly and in a rigorous way together. It's really important to us that you have taken the time to be here, to have traveled, to have left your families and loved ones for periods of time to do this important work together. Ask you to join me in welcoming Stuart for some remarks as well.
Thank you, Am. And it's wonderful to have you here. It's wonderful to formally welcome you now to the opening of Horizons. Am and I have been working at the building out of a new university infrastructure dedicated to community-engaged research called CERI, the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU, for the last 3 years. And working with Am in this context, as many of you will know who have worked with Am in the past, is a remarkable experience of learning the rich networks of collaboration that are part of research, knowledge mobilization in this city. And Am knows almost everyone involved, as some of you will recognize. I say that in some jest, but only a little bit of jest. I want to say a few words about CERI, just to begin as an institutional dream, really. It's rare in one's career that you get an opportunity. The university provides us with funding to set up something, an institution, an infrastructure, a collaborative network that we care about deeply, that we want to see built up and sustained, that we want to have a life within the institution and much more broadly in the city, across the country. And that's our dream for CERI. It is a collective project. It is a collective project of researchers, of networks, of community collaboration, of graduate students, of undergraduate students. It's a creative and impactful project that spawned a number of research initiatives in a way that centers and supports collaborative, community engaged research. What brings us together, but what also feeds our work, what we share, is the work of community engaged research in all its challenge and difficulty. It's a difficult time that we're living in. The summer air reminds us of warmth and even a new feeling, a new time. But the hurt and hardness of the world doesn't go away. And so we must look for wayfinding tools, maps, and practices that help us to understand and not contribute to hurt in the world. For us, community-engaged research is that focal point. It is among those fields of action and knowledge creation, those ways of knowing and collaborating together, that as our opening keynote speaker, Rubén Gaztambide-Fernandez, will say, are hard. They often fail. They require these collaborations, thinking about how we make solidarity in our research and knowledge creation projects, how we sustain ethical relationships between communities and academic researchers, communities and public institutions, indigenous nations, and settlers. What is needed in these relationships is more than good intentions. Structural support and action are necessary to sustain solidarity amongst community researchers and the academy. Our hope is that Horizons will not only help us to learn how to support this work while showcasing a host of remarkable projects methods, and activities, but also reveal how to talk about and address the crises that are upon us, how to support social transformation enabled through community-engaged research. We're living through one of the most disruptive and transformative eras in living memory. And in this context, community-engaged research and knowledge mobilization that supports sustainable, inclusive, and just futures is urgent, necessary, and filled with possibilities and hope for a world on the horizon that we can dream together. So welcome to all of you. We are excited about the conference and the program that will unfold over the next 3 days. A few things before we move on to Elder Margaret and Dorothy Christian. We want to, first of all, draw your attention to the Horizons zine done by Marlene Yoon, which we're extremely excited about. It also highlights two of our key sponsors and bookstores that we wanted to work with as part of this conference, Massey Books and Iron Dog Books. It includes a schedule that you'll all see inside, so please carry this around in your pocket as needed. I also want to draw your attention to the conference app. The Whova app is, as somebody who doesn't regularly use conference apps, it's dynamite and really easy to use. So I'm not sponsoring them, but I am saying it's worth using. And I thank all those folks who have already begun contributing to it and adding photos and so on. It's a record of our work together. Couple of other key points, the Wi-Fi. Please note that with the Wi-Fi, the information about the ID or the account ID and the password are correct. You need to go to SFUnet and then enter that information, and it will fall into place as needed. The hashtag for, Twitter hashtag for is hashtag SFU Horizons 2022. Please use it. Put up photos, put up thoughts as you're going through the panel, as you're going through panels, as you're going through roundtables, in conversations. There'll be some other administrative things and certainly thank yous that we want to share, but I'm going to pass it back to Am for some welcomes.
So it's my honor to welcome Elder Margaret George to provide a territorial welcome for us today. Elder Margaret is a recognized visionary in education and community service, and for 21 years, Elder Margaret has worked with SFU's Indigenous Student Center as part of the Elders Program. Please welcome Elder Margaret George.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Nap time for seniors. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. It's great to be out and about after so many months of being in isolation, trying to get rid of this COVID that doesn't seem to want to leave us. Just when we think it's gone, it's back in the neighborhood again. So take care of yourselves, each and every one, and just be very careful. It's so good to be here. A quick prayer, and we'll get this event going. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together this evening. Just guide each and every one of us. Take care of our families while we're away from home at this time. And just always remember that we are the leaders and the mentors of those who follow us, those who witness what we do and what we say. I ask, Great Spirit, just a very special blessing on all the young children within our community, as they are going to be our future leaders, and a very special blessing on each and every one present here today, and for people that will be doing presentations for this conference. Thank you for inviting me on my relations.
Thank you so much, Elder Margaret. Next, I wanted to invite up Jeff Dirksen, who's the Dean of Graduate Studies and a professor in English, but also an advisory board member with the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU. We've been supported by a wide group of faculty members, including Jeff, who have supported our work from the very beginning. Welcome, Jeff Dirksen.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thanks everyone who works at CIRI for organizing the conferences. Both Am and Stuart have pointed out it's been a bit stutter steps, which has helped to build the anticipation, and it truly has felt like a grand collaborative project as it's moved along. As both Am and Stuart have pointed out, the intensity of the present and the possibility and inevitability of social transformation, I think, are obviously key grounds that this conference will address. But I also feel that the very act of this conference, the very act of us gathering and the work that CIRI has done so far, are also part of the transformation of the university, which of course goes hand in hand. Sometimes as a vanguard, other times belatedly in social transformation. And I hope that the work that CIRI is doing will continue to push SFU towards its forms of community-engaged research, that we try to do at all levels, whether it's at the level of the neighborhood or whether it's at a larger global level, that moves away from that kind of extractive relationship to knowledge that universities have often had. So, as the Dean of Graduate Studies, I mostly look to graduate students to see what they're excited about and what kind of work that they're doing. And I see that inevitably it has a community aspect to it. They might not define it as community-engaged research, but now they have the tools to do that thanks to the folks around CIRI. But just that drive and that desire to move their work through communities in a way that I think if we just simply call it knowledge circulation, it doesn't capture that, but really looking to transform communities and be transformed themselves. That's a key thing that I see graduate students looking towards and doing, actively doing, more and more so. So, SFU as a young university in Canada, so started in 1965 around the nation-building project of 1967, Canada's late modernist colonial restructuring, in a sense, is a university that carries that bad legacy with it as well. And I know that Dorothy, my fabulous colleague, will talk about the role of Indigenous knowledges within community-engaged research, but I also feel that CIRI and community-engaged research is giving a major rethink to how universities relate to both the residual older colonial structures and the new colonial structures that are continually being built up. So in terms of social transformation, that movement towards a future, I almost did academic bureaucratic speak, I was going to say future-oriented, but really just having an engine like CIRI in the university has been really important. And of course, it's led by compelling figures. The folks who are on the advisory board are extremely compelling as well. And I do see CIRI doing some hard work in reminding SFU of what its role was in the past, the good aspects of its role in the past of community-engaged research at the neighborhood level, coming from the geography department in East Vancouver, some specific work they did there, work around public health, and then even some of the work that we've seen recently through landslide prevention and just dealing with some of the climate catastrophes that have come up in a super intense way in this region. So I'm going to be able to stick around for some of the conference. I'm happy to do that. And I just really want to thank everyone in CIRI and raise up my hands to the work that they've done, and also welcome you and hope that this informs the work that you're able to do back in your neighborhoods. And just the way that both Am and Stuart were talking about not only being community-based, but how to engage, in ways that will include, expanded modes of empathy, militant sincerity, and all other forms that are just going to challenge the way that we've inherited some of these legacies of research, I think is just fabulous and necessary at the moment, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic and a great way to bring us together. The Advisory Board on CIRI has been a tremendous asset for us to help us lead and develop this initiative. And I want to just pick up on one theme that Jeff mentioned, which is the way a project like this exists within an institution. Community-engaged research is always on the sideline, on the margins, on the edges of how research traditions work, of how institutions operate, often how we collaborate together in many ways, pushing the seams of how those relationships work. And I think as an institution, as an initiative that exists in the university, we've always had a view in two directions simultaneously, recognizing how to work with an institution and draw resources and ways of supporting those outside of the institution that then require us to look outwards and make sure that we are reminded of how to build ethical, sustained relationships. And these things are challenging. These things are difficult. I'm really excited by the talk that Dr. Gaztambide-Fernandez, Rubén, my friend Rubén, will share with us. We now, though, want to turn our attention to situate the opening of our conference around where we are, around the land and around indigeneity, indigenous research as part of the field of community-engaged research. I want to acknowledge that in reaching out to Ron Johnston, the director of the Office for Aboriginal Peoples, he advised us that in opening up our conference, that what we wanted to do was to embed our thinking, our work, within the land and within indigenous communities and nations that are part of this place, as the very beginning of our conversations together, to recognize how indigenous communities and nations have been involved and unjustly extracted in research relationships, extracted from in research relationships, and to bring that into view so that those themes and concerns are part of our reflection as we move forward. That provocation led to a rich and wonderful engagement and conversation with Dr. Dorothy Christian. And to open our conference this afternoon now, it's my honor to welcome Dr. Dorothy Christian, who is a member of the Shuswapnik, and I apologize, and Syilx Nations from the interior of BC. She currently serves as the Associate Director of Policy and Pedagogy in graduate and postdoctoral studies. Her research in the academic community has consistently centered Indigenous knowledge even before those terms were recognized in the academy. Among her many projects in 2018, Dorothy guest curated Voices from the Western Regions of Turtle Island at the Imaginative Film Festival in Toronto, the largest Indigenous film festival in the world. It's our honor to welcome Dr. Dorothy Christian to open our discussion.
Bring some water with me. Oh my, I have to tell you that I'm a little nervous. I find it sometimes uncomfortable to be in this, what I call the cultural interface space. But I see some familiar faces out there who I've interacted with in the institutions. And so I know that there are friends out there. So before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude that I live, work, and play on the lands of my Coast Salish cousins, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, the Coquitlam, the Semiahoo, the Katzie, the Tsawwassen, and Kakite peoples, the nations whose lands all of the campuses of SFU sits on. I'd also like to extend prayers of gratitude to the spirits and the peoples of these lands for the privilege of living on their territories. I bring greetings from my home community of Splatchin, which is one of 17 nations of our 17 communities of the Secwepemc Nation. I'd also like to give thanks to the organizing committee, and I spoke directly with Dr. Points, but I know that there were all kinds of hands behind the scenes that do the real work. And I just want to give thanks to them. And I really would like to hold up my hands to all of you for bringing this important work forward. It's been a long time coming, I must say. I'll just do a little bit of a self-introduction. Some of the things that you never see on bios or CVs that you read online. I'm from the Secwepemc Scale peoples of the Interior Plateau regions of what is now known as British Columbia. I carry 3 names from the land that I am responsible for. I use my Secwepemc name publicly, Huchlang. I'm sharing some insider Indigenous knowledge, if you will, that may give some insight into Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. The 2 other names that I carry are connected to the concept of transformation. With each name that I received, I was told a story, a teaching about the meaning of that name that was bestowed upon me. I won't tell you those stories here, but I will tell you that one speaks of transforming from the spiritual realm to the physical realm, and the other speaks of transforming the space, either to be one of a space of destruction or a space of purification. That is, cleaning and clearing the space so that new things can come in. I would like to think that the energy of that name that I carry is here with me today to clear the space of the status quo and to put new things into the space so that we can move forward together in this research space. So what am I talking about today? We all know that knowledge production is supposed to be what happens at universities. And sadly, knowledge extraction is what has occurred in many Indigenous communities since the time of first contact. And I see that I saw in one of the programs that I read that someone had named my keynote Creative Solidarity and the Future of Community-Based Research. To do that, I'm providing the framework and the historical background of research in Indigenous community to have a look at what needs to be transformed. So knowledge extraction from Indigenous communities has taken many forms when Euro-Western researchers from various disciplines have been in our communities. For instance, anthropology, archaeology, environmental studies, literature, and the sciences. And of course, in the arts sector, cultural stories, songs, and Indigenous designs have literally been stolen from individuals and families. And sadly, that's still going on out there in the world today. So, from my Indigenous Secwepemc scale perspective, Indigenous worldviews are very different from the Euro-Western worldview. And that's the worldview that dominates most universities around, at least in North America. In the Euro-Western knowledge ways, the stories that come out of Indigenous communities are treated as myths and as folklore. It is not seen as knowledge. And this is finally beginning to change in the academy. So my Secwepemc Scale worldview is about living a self-determined path on the land that I was born to in an interrelated way with all the other beings that I share the land with, and for all of us to work together in harmony to continue to perpetuate life on that space. So these are the lands that I come from. Whoops, it's going too fast. This landmark has been named by the settler peoples of my territories as the Enderby Cliffs. I know that we have a name for this place in our language. So this is the land that I'm from, and the Shuswap River runs throughout my territories. These are some of my ancestors who walked the land before me. My great-grandfather, my great-aunties, my granny, and these are some of the beings that we share the lands with, that we have to take into consideration when we are doing things on the land. So the plants and the medicines, the clouds even, the winged ones, the water, the sands, the land, the earth. And nowadays, we stand together to protect Mother Earth on many different levels. So in terms of reclaiming Indigenous knowledge and our place on the land, in the 1970s, the Inuit stood up and said no to TV programming from the South. I spoke with Zacharias Canuck. He was one of the knowledge keepers and filmmakers that spoke to me during my field work. And he told me about how the elders stood up and said no, because there weren't any images from Inuit country, nor could he hear the languages, his Inuktitut language. During that time, my community was also documenting our own knowledge. The people in my community had the foresight to start documenting our elders way back then. This was a very exciting time in Indian country because people were standing up and saying no more. The number of Indigenous communities in my territories shut down a regional Department of Indian Affairs office, because up until that time, every time we needed to do something, we had to go to this Indian Affairs office and get an Indian agent to approve whatever discussion or dialogue we wanted to have. So the people just stood up and said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to deal directly with Vancouver, with the BC Regional Office. So it was also during this time when people started documenting our own histories and our own knowledge. So my community has a beautiful set of archives where there are our elders from previous decades who have left us with their knowledge. And in the 1980s, Indigenous women writers called out mainstream writers who were writing Indigenous stories without permission from the people, families, or communities. Some of you may know some of these women who were kicking down doors: Jeanette Armstrong, Lee Miracle, Mariah Campbell. I was with them at some of those meetings where some really good work happened. And I was really learning a lot as I sat with these women and traveled with them all over the country. Now, 1990s was a decade of what I call modern-day Indian wars. In 1990, we had the so-called Oka crisis here in Canada. In 1995, we had the Gustafson Lake standoff here in British Columbia. And at the same time that was happening, the Ipperwash situation was happening in Ontario, where one Indigenous man was killed. And during that same decade, the Zapatistas in Mexico also picked up arms because the beginning of the North American Free Trade Agreement was going to do all kinds of damage to their traditional economic ways of trading amongst themselves. So when I talk about change, this was the beginning time of change. This is when we started reclaiming our knowledges. And you have to remember that Indigenous nations are oral historians. Our histories were in oral stories that were passed down from generation to generation. But all of this time, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is a time when we started adapting technology to record our own stories and to tell our own stories without it being filtered through an academic who knew nothing about us or our communities. So we've adapted our oral stories to the written form, and of course now we do stories in the visual form, what I call visual storytelling. And then we finally moved to developing relationships between Indigenous peoples and settler peoples. Indigenous peoples in this country got upset and angry with the accumulated unethical things that happened in our communities, and the leadership came together and in 1998 developed the First Peoples Principle of OCAP, which is short form for ownership, control, access, and possession. Because the research that was happening in our communities were not beneficial to us, nor were they respectful of the people. The next development happened in 2018. If you go to this government website that I have up here, there's a 47-page chapter, Chapter 9, that talks about research involving the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. It's a substantive chapter, but it covers a lot of really important issues. So if you have the time, if you're interested in Indigenous research or looking at Indigenous research, then that's the place to find it. And then in 2019, the tri-agency, SSHRC, CI, HR, and NSERC formally addressed how to research in Indigenous communities. And that's not that long ago. When you stop to think about it, it's only 4 years. So to give an example of how I researched from an Indigenous way of knowing and doing, my PhD research was in an Indigenous research paradigm, and I privileged Indigenous knowledge. And I did a talking in conversation, which means it was an Indigenous to Indigenous conversation where we discussed Indigenous principles, and I basically was looking at how does our cultural knowledge inform how filmmakers do their production practices when we're out in the field. Because I worked in the film and television industry before I came to grad school. So I knew when I was out there in the field that I was doing things very differently from my peers on the national team that I was on and for the broadcaster that I was working for. Another example, a specific example that talks about ethical ways of researching in our communities. When I handed in my dissertation to grad studies at UBC, I put in a caveat at the beginning. The paragraph talked about how I realized that the university assigned me copyright of the work, and I accepted that copyright for the work that I had done. However, I did not accept copyright for any Indigenous knowledge that was shared with me. I talked to 14 knowledge keepers from many different nations across Turtle Island. So there was no way that I was going to claim their words, because I had Seneca, I had Haida, I had Secwepemc, I had Cree, I had Hopi, and I had Inuit knowledge that had been shared with me. And so a specific example of that was in my own nation. I was given permission to use a coyote story, and he's the main dude in our stories. So it's like I was allowed to use the full story in its entirety, and it was in the language with English subtitles. And I used that story throughout my writing because I was using it as a teaching tool to talk about specific concepts that I was making reference to, whether it was in my methodology chapter or setting the philosophical way of looking at things. So accountabilities in Indian country is very different. So my methodology chapter, I talked about the layers of accountabilities that I had, because I made a presentation to my own chief and council and a presentation to the elders group in my community, because first and foremost, I want them to know about what I'm doing. So if they hear about it from other peoples outside of my community, they will know what I'm up to. And there were so many other things too. It's like I can't get into the methodologies and methods that I used. I just don't have the time. I was told I only have 15 minutes, or 15 to 20 minutes. So this is what's happening now. You may have all heard of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was adopted by the UN in 2007, and Canada endorsed it in 2016. In November 2019, BC was the first jurisdiction in Canada to implement the UN Declaration through a piece of legislation called the Declaration Act. So that's in the international global framework. On the national level, of course, you all know we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that started in 2008, and the commissioners handed in their final report in 2015 with 94 calls to action. It's important to know that we had another report before this. It was called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP. The final report was completed in 1996. We never heard anything about this report. It sat on people's shelves and gathered dust. And if you go back and you look at the two documents, they virtually have similar content. So it was brought forward in 1996, just after what I call the modern-day Indian Wars. I'm sure it was a reaction of the federal government, who felt that they had to do something because the Indians were going to war and they were picking up guns. So I think it kind of made people sit back and start thinking a bit. So just to know that that report also exists. And in 2017, Ron Johnson's Office of Aboriginal Peoples put out the Walk this Path With Us report with specific reference to some of the calls of action from the TRC. And then 2021, last year, Dr. Pigeon and her team released the Looking Forward Indigenous Pathways to and through Simon Fraser University. And the last thing, of course, that I need to bring attention to is the remains of the 215 that were announced on May the 27th, 2021. I just returned from the one-year memorial of this, and I think that the finding of those unmarked graves has shifted and transformed the dialogue between Indigenous peoples and settler peoples in this country, because the stories that we know we've had in our communities for generations, now other people know that they're true, that they're not made up. So that's it, my smoke signals to you, the end.
Just going to switch the slides.
Well, let me, first off, I want to acknowledge Alicia and Alicia Massey, as I will in just a moment, because it's odd having someone come up and do all this work, and you don't know who she is, but she's a force behind this conference. But before I say that, I want to thank Dorothy, Dr. Dorothy Christian, for providing us with guidance and locating Indigenous knowledge, the history of this work, not only nationally, but locally, the way in which our own institution has responded and attempted to create actions around that. Dr. Christian's revelations of the history of extraction of knowledge, the way in which a transition through a series of decades of action and confrontation have led to a different way of addressing and recognizing Indigenous knowledge, our accountability that we are all now responsible for, and in fact this conference is part of. That dialogue has been transformed in the face of horrific injustices, including the finding of the remains of 215 children in May of 2021. And so we thank you, and with great gratitude, appreciate the opening and guidance you've provided for us with questions to think about and to return to as we encounter other work in Indigenous-centered research, in methodologies, and in projects that are underway. I now want to say, I want to acknowledge that, as Jeff pointed out earlier, there are many people that make a conference like this possible, and amongst those are people who you see walking around, and I want to acknowledge Alicia Massey, who you will hear me say more about otherwise, but Alicia Massey, please. Alicia has been... Many of us will know many people who have gone through COVID at difficult and trying times. But as the conference like this is coming to a realization, wouldn't it happen that Alicia ran into COVID, or COVID ran into Alicia? And nonetheless, persisting through that and working to try to support from afar and then up close, including today, as you will see, is a representation of the kind of commitment that the team of people who you will meet and we will acknowledge. But I need to acknowledge Alicia, who's a doctoral student in the School of Communication to boot. So let's say good things on that front. Thank you. Okay, Horizons is a conference that attempts to bring together many people from many different areas of the country and indeed the world to exchange around community-engaged research. And as we were thinking about the development of this conference, amongst the communities of people that we wanted to engage are young people. And in thinking about young people as part of community-engaged research, somebody who's done tremendous work in this area and continues to do tremendous work in this area is somebody I've known for 15 years now, I think, at various conferences, at various encounters. And having the opportunity to invite Rubén to this session to add to our conversation, to share with us the challenges of solidarity that are central to our work and yet always a challenge for us to achieve, is something that does great honor to this conference. It's a pleasure then to turn the stage and turn the mic over to Dr. Rubén Gaztambide-Fernandez. Rubén, as I will call, is a research professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at U of T. You will see his bio in full on HUVA, but I just want to note a few things: that his research is concerned with questions of symbolic boundaries, of the dynamics of cultural production, processes of identification in educational contexts. He draws on a rich array of critical intellectual traditions, including decolonial, postcolonial theory and feminist theory. His work in critical sociology informs his understanding of curriculum, teaching, and research. Currently, he's director of the Youth Research Lab at the Center for Urban Schooling at OISE, where he's principal investigator of the Youth Solidarities Across Boundaries project, a participatory action research project with Latinx and Indigenous youth in the city of Toronto. At the YLR, that's the Youth Research Lab, at the YLR he also oversees and supports several youth participatory action research projects, including the editorial board of Insight, a youth-run online research journal, as well as a study of the practices of participatory facilitators, something that I'm excited to be involved in as a project that CIRI will be involved in as we move forward. His theoretical work focuses on the relationship between creativity, decolonialization, and solidarity. I think I need some of this water that I conveniently left for myself up here. It's an honor now to turn the mic over to Rubén, whose keynote talk is titled Creative Solidarity and the Futurities of Community Engaged Research. Rubén? Welcome. Absolutely.
That's okay. You got me here live. You don't need a picture. Thank you, Stuart, for that kind and generous introduction, as always. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Yeah, the light is blinding, isn't it? That's okay. And thank you to Dr. Christian for giving us a context here for this conversation. I'm also going to do a bit of scraping in the beginning of my talk, and I hope that you will forgive my intrepid elaborations here as I try to do a bit of clearing in order to think about something new with you. And I'm sorry that somehow. Actually, I'll tell you a story. So the plant where I come from, we exchange names when we meet someone, and it's really funny that somehow the title of my talk ended up getting on top of your talk, or somehow attributed to you. Because as it happens, I actually changed the title of my talk. And so it's just a big name exchange, which is great. It's we're in family here. Yeah. So the actual title of my talk is Beyond Community as Fetish: Creative Solidarity and the Futurities of Community Engaged Research. I want to start by saying buenas noches, buenas tardes, good afternoon, and saludos a todos que están aquí con nosotros. Greetings to you all. I am here visiting you from my temporary home in the city of Takaronto, in the Haudenosaunee territory. Although I am originally from the Caribbean island of Boriken, which is probably known to some of you as Puerto Rico, and I'm very honored to be here today as a guest on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I also want to thank the organizers of the Horizons Conference for affording me this privileged position of being able to speak to you and to share some ideas and provocations as we set ourselves to the task of sharing our experiences with and our commitments to engaging communities in our personal, political, intellectual, and spiritual work. I want to say that a part of my talk before I start is quite directly addressed to academics, and I'm going to hold you to account. I'm going to hold us to account. And I want to say that because the critique that I want to offer is directed specifically to modes of doing research in community that are very far from the very rich and very committed work that people like Dr. Christian have done. I'm really looking forward to reading your work. Thank you for offering that as a contrast to what I'm about to talk about. And so I will begin. We love communities, or so you might think. Recent years have seen a concerted effort among universities and academic institutions to engage communities and to respond to community needs. The establishment of the Community Engaged Research Initiative at Simon Fraser University in January of 2020, our host for this gathering, is a case in point. CRE is committed, in the words of its directors, who you just met, to, quote, creating a social infrastructure to enhance, deepen, and institutionalize support systems that enable community research collaborations to succeed and flourish, unquote. At my own institution, the University of Toronto, the Center for Community Partnerships was established in 2005 to, quote, work with students, faculty, and community partners to explore and enact a collaborative vision of a better world, unquote. And there are many other examples. Your neighbor, UBC's Learning Exchange, and my neighbor, York University's Experience Hub. And it is worth noting that these last three are primarily focused on community-engaged learning, as opposed to explicitly being directed toward research. Yet these initiatives share in common the idea that to engage the community is something universities ought to do. This idea is supported by major federal funding agencies in Canada through programs like the Partnership Program of SSHRC, and most recently through the SSHRC-initiated Race and Gender and Diversity Initiative. This initiative, quote, supports community-based and community-led research carried out in partnership with post-secondary institutions that is based on the lived experiences of underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. While many academics, particularly academics in the Global South, I want to underscore, have been committed to community-engaged research for many decades, only in the last decade, or perhaps two, have there been institutional efforts to support this work. And we should ponder why. Why have universities, infamous as they are for being bastions of elitism, implicated in slavery, foundational tools of colonialism, and given their increasing role in expanding neoliberal capitalism, why are universities and so many academics suddenly wanting to be community engaged? What precisely does that mean? And whose interest exactly does this engagement serve? There are many reasons to be suspicious of this love that we academics apparently have for communities, and this desire for community engagement. After all, as many of us surely know, and has been described earlier tonight, universities do not have a great track record when it comes to actually engaging communities. And that's a generous way of putting it. Surely you are familiar, and you've heard tonight, of the pattern of the academic by parachute, arriving in a community setting prior to any relationship or invitation, promising to solve community problems, only to suddenly depart when the funding runs out or when the work actually gets difficult. Often these difficulties arise from the community's responses to the paternalistic approach that academic institutions prescribe for engaging communities, and their pushback against the patronizing and deficit views that define how resources are distributed and projects are administered, often in a top-down manner. The extractive nature of so many so-called community-engaged projects, where the knowledge generated by and with communities is then only attributed to the academics, who then build individual careers on this knowledge, is also widespread. And as this stolen knowledge is packaged for academic consumption, communities often end up misrepresented, frozen in the block of time between the academic's arrival and departure, as if communities were not dynamic, diverse, and evolving. And these are only a few of the crimes that we academics have committed and continue to commit under the banner of community-engaged research. And I am sure that many of us in this room can think of many other examples. Now, notice that I have quite deliberately been using the pronoun we so far. And let me be clear about who I mean by we, and by extension, who I mean by they, and what precisely I see as the problem. First of all, by we, of course, I mean to include myself. I am an academic with a well-paid, tenured, and very secure position at a very elite university, in part because of my own community-engaged research, and I'm not about to let myself off the hook of my own critique. This we includes academics, like many of you in this room, who have been doing community-engaged research for a very long time, and who are well aware of the challenges of doing this work, and who bring an ethic of reflexivity to hold ourselves accountable. Yes, we are part of this we, but this we also includes universities and academic institutions that unreflexively and carelessly turn towards communities as if we know what a community is, and as if we were not implicated in the struggles of communities. They, of course, are the many communities and members of communities that, despite their well-founded apprehension, driven by a deep commitment to generating knowledge in order to find solutions to the challenges they face, from time to time, and often with a good amount of healthy hesitation, agree to engage us as part of the political strategy. A kind of university-engaged activism, if I may flip the coin for a moment. Sometimes this we and this they overlap. And certainly there are many of us in this room that identify with both and that find ourselves anxiously traversing the boundaries between academic institutions and the communities that we belong to and from which we come, often to our own neurotic ambivalence. Maybe I speak for myself. But while there are overlaps, the very use of the phrase community-engaged research, which presumes that real and legitimate research is something we academics do in the absence of, or at least disengaged from, they, communities, connotes the implied hierarchy between the we, academics, and the they, communities. Now, whether we, academics, are a community, or whether the term has any relevance for what happens in universities, is entirely beside the point. Even if it were, surely we're not talking about a community of overpaid professors and academic conference when we say community-engaged research. Or do we? The problem, if I may be allowed a moment of provocation, is that us academics and universities more specifically continue to pursue community engagement as if we were innocent participants, as if we knew what defines communities, as if we were not in some way implicated in the very problems that communities face and seek to solve. As we begin this conference and look to the days ahead, together, in community, I want to pause on these as-ifs that haunt community-engaged research. I want to think about why it is that academics act as if we know what community means and what defines community, and as if we were not implicated, and often complicit in the very structures that produce the challenges against which communities struggle. Why does community-engaged research often progress as if academics knew that what they mean by community, even though it is generally accepted by academics themselves that we don't actually agree on what constitutes a community? I want to be really clear that communities themselves don't really have this problem. communities know exactly who they are. It's academics that have this problem. And the fact that it is a problem for academics tells us something about why the turn to community engagement should be suspicious. Community studies scholar Graham Crowe tells us, quote, that a community involves a group of people with something in common. But it is less easy to find agreement about what that something is, unquote. Crowe warns us that communities do not come in uniform packages, ready for one standardized mode of analysis. And I will add one standardized mode of engagement. Some academics argue that there is no such thing as a community, dismissing the concept as a vague idea that invokes some romantic view of the past, as a way to make judgments about the apparent deficiencies of contemporary social relations. Others argue that the sense of community is ephemeral and only activated in the context of struggle, either when people come together to face a challenge or when a threat emerges that risks the boundaries that protect perceived interests or claims to belonging. In his book, The Country and the City, Raymond Williams, one of the founders of cultural studies, observed that contemporary notions of community emerged in the context of struggle. Community, he argues, became a reality when economic and political rights were fought for and partially gained. Whether communities are ideational, spatial, based on identification, material conditions, shared histories, the limited time, the feeling or the sense of community, is heightened when there is a perceived threat to the boundaries, explicit or implicit, that define community. Or when there is a need to come together in order to confront a challenge or deal with the aftermath of an event. This point is important because community-engaged research is often defined by a commitment to generating knowledge in order to address the challenges that communities face. And it is these challenges that often define what constitutes the community. To illustrate this, let's return to the language of the Race, Gender, and Diversity Initiative sponsored by SHRC, which was intended to support, again, quote, underrepresented and disadvantaged groups, unquote. What defines communities for SHRC, and I would suggest this is true for the large majority of community-engaged academic research, is the condition of being, quote, marginalized on the basis of their ethnicity and other identity factors, unquote. Not their acts of resistance, not the richness of their cultural histories, not the dynamism and diversity that animates them, not their heterogeneity, but their disadvantages. Marginalization and underrepresentation is what defines community in the eyes of academics. For now, I am not going to focus on the problematic deficit framework implied in this definition of community, or even argue for or against the merits of framing our commitments around the fact that some communities do in fact experience significant disadvantages and marginalization, and that we should care about that. What I want to focus is on the question, why is it that we academics pursue this work as if we were not actually complicit in the production of this very marginalization, and as if our efforts didn't often have the paradoxical effect of deepening and strengthening the conditions that produce inequality in the first place. In other words, when we, or SHRC, or any given university unit, SERI notwithstanding, talk about the underrepresented and disadvantaged groups, we often act as if our own institutions were not guilty of producing the very misrepresentations of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups that are part and parcel of their marginalization. Moreover, the neoliberal university, entrenched as it is in the complex flows of capitalist accumulation, is a central player in ongoing economic exploitation and the production of poverty, homelessness, food precarity, and land theft. The University of Toronto's reluctance to disinvest from fossil fuels, its involvement in the digitization of urban spaces, and its continued growth as the largest non-governmental landowner, I should say land thief, of the Greater Toronto Area is a case in point. Of course, capital accumulation is not all that universities do. The university is, after all, a contested space of struggle, and many of us are committed to contesting the space of the university and channeling its resources to other uses. But we cannot do that pretending that we have not benefited from the role that universities have played in creating the conditions against which communities struggle, and we should be reflective about our own implication and remain suspicious about our institutional commitments to communities. We could be generous and maybe optimistic and hope that universities are somehow awakening to their responsibility to communities. Perhaps so. But I want us to pause and suggest that there is something else at stake in what I would like to suggest has become the fetishization of community as an object against which universities and we academics more generally project our own guilt, our own shame, and our own fears and desires about our futures and our own sense of who we are and what is the purpose of our work. I want to suggest, drawing on the work of Jamaican Black feminist sociologist Shirley Ann Tate, that community has become, quote, sticky with affect, and that this affective draw to the idea of communities in general and marginalized communities in particular is an expression of our psychic anxieties regarding the role of academics and universities in the production of inequality and marginalization. For universities and academics, I want to suggest the community is the other in the mirror, the object against which we refract our guilt and our anxieties about our own privileged positions, but through which we also secure our own imagined futures. The very fact that universities have bracketed this very space we are inhabiting at this moment as the space for, quote, community engagement, where we get to step aside from the real academic work of the university, which presumably is not itself a community, or perhaps the big brother of communities, should be reason enough to pause and reflect on how community fits within the university's libidinal economy, becoming a fetish with and against which we define ourselves and our work as academics. So what do I mean by community as fetish? Let me offer two related but somewhat incongruent reference points. I'm going to get slightly theoretical here for a moment, so bear with me. First, the Marxist concept of commodity fetishism, and second, Freud's conceptualization of the fetish. So for Marx, as objects are made into commodities to be exchanged in the market for money, right, things we buy, the labor relations and economic conditions required to make the product, so for example, the cost of obtaining the raw materials and the labor conditions of those who extract those materials to assemble an object, like this table right here, are obscured and made invisible and thus fetishized into the monetary value that may or may not coincide with the actual cost of production. The easiest way to illustrate this is to ask you to pause for a moment to consider your relationship to your clothes. Are you comfortable in your clothes? Do you like the way your clothes feel? How much did you spend on those clothes? Did you think it was a reasonable price? What if now I asked you to make, who made the clothes? Who made your clothes? How much were those people paid for making those clothes? Where did the materials come from? Who profited from the money you paid for those clothes? What was the environmental impact of making those clothes? And after thinking about these questions, do you still like your clothes? Do they still feel good on you? Do you still like the way they make you look? For Marx, commodity fetishism involves the erasure and the forgetting of the conditions of production in order to extract value from commodities so that the things we own will make us feel good. And crucial in that process is for the consumer, us, to forget, or at least to ignore, the conditions of production in order not just to justify, but to enjoy them. The conditions of production become fetishized into the product itself, obscured and forgotten in order to facilitate and justify the financial exchange. We, as consumers, must act as if we didn't know that someone was likely exploited to produce our clothing. Material resources were likely extracted from colonized land in order to continue to participate in commodity exchange. In this way, as buyers, we are complicit in maintaining the social relations that make the production of commodities like our clothing possible, but that the commodity form leads us to forget, or at least to ignore. Likewise, universities have a tendency to forget the social conditions that produce the need for communities to come together as such, perceiving community as objects to be engaged, if not necessarily as commodities to be consumed, as if universities were not complicit in producing those very conditions. I hope that made sense. Freud offered a very similar but not quite compatible conceptualization of the fetish. For Freud, in order to cope with our traumas, our childhood traumas, and difficult emotions, insecurities and losses, we project our desires to external objects, like computers, or to people. Fetishization for Freud also involved forgetting, but not so much of the conditions of production or the objects we fetishize, but of the very traumas, fears, guilt, and other hard emotions that we project onto the objects that we desire. Here, again, fetishization allows us to act as if we were not experiencing fear, as if we were not feeling insecure, as if we did not experience guilt for our own complicity. The problem for Freud is that precisely because the fetish becomes the screen on which we project our fears and desires, it also becomes the object that we at once love and that we want to destroy, that we want to protect, while at once erase and forget. For now, that's all for the theory for the moment. I will put aside the problem of juxtaposing the concept of fetishization from a Marxist and a Freudian perspective. We'll forget about that for a moment. And instead, I want to borrow the critique that Robert Cooley and Stephen Dunn make of consumer activism. And I want to suggest that understanding the community as fetish reveals, quote, a dynamic process whereby the subject, in this case us academics and universities, refuse to know something that we knew all along. If, as I have suggested, academics know all too well the difficulty of defining what a community is and the many complex ways of understanding how communities come to be and unfold, why then do community-engaged initiatives often operate as if communities were stable entities with easily defined boundaries and stable and unchanging identities, defined by their marginalization? I want to suggest that acknowledging the permeability and the instability of what constitutes a community would require us academics to recognize the rather dysfunctional, hierarchical, and deeply egocentric ways in which universities operate. It would require for us to name and examine the implicit and sometimes explicit boundaries that delimit the university as a community, and how these exclusionary boundaries are the very structures that define the other side of that boundary, the community that we are claiming to engage. Fetishizing the community is something out there, beyond the boundaries of the university, that allows us academics to imagine ourselves as benefactors without recognizing all the privileges granted by the power dynamics that enforce the boundaries between the university and the community. And so we act as if we know what a community is, precisely because if we stop to ask the question, we would have to confront our own anxieties about ourselves as a community and the extreme dysfunction that makes us a community. We thus often romanticize the community and see community engagement as a way to escape our own dysfunction, to assure ourselves that we can be better by projecting our desires to the other. By projecting our desire to this other community out there, whom we seek to engage, in part because we project onto them a vision of how we would like to see ourselves. Yet this desire for community is contradictory. Because as pointed out earlier, we also imagine the communities we engage as somehow incomplete, as disadvantaged, struggling against marginalization and inequality. In fact, this is crucial for defining the communities that we presumably engage, as expressed in the goals of the Shirk Race, Gender, and Diversity Initiative. And here, the community as fetish serves yet another important purpose for sustaining the psychic lives of academics. Just like charity becomes a procedure through which those who have material resources save their souls by giving to those who lack them, community engagement becomes the root of our own salvation, a means to ensure a future for the university. Yet securing this future means, again, securing the very structures that keep the boundary between university and community in place, which, as I have already suggested, are part and parcel of the power dynamics that produce inequality and marginalization. How do we know this? Pause for a second and ponder. Can you imagine a future when the phrase community-engaged research or community-engaged learning is a redundancy, where the very definition of a university hinged on being community-engaged? This would require a complete undoing of the university as we know it. And with that, a dismantling of the hierarchies that define the boundary between university and community. And along with that, of all the privileges and the material and symbolic conditions that allow us to do the very work we do as academics, including, yes, community-engaged research. If I am right, even if I am just partly right, that we academics have a fetish for communities, how do we proceed? Does it mean that we give up on our commitments to community-engaged research? Do we relinquish our desire for our work to make a difference in the world? I want to assure you that if my answer was yes, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. Or at least, I would have prepared an escape route out of this room immediately after this talk. A fetish, at least in the Freudian sense, and here lies one of the crucial differences between Marx and Freud, is not necessarily, or by definition, a bad thing. The fact that some of us academics project our desires and fantasies onto the communities where we work, project our desires and fantasies onto the communities that we work with, as Cluley and Dunn point out. Oh my God, my own writing sometimes just befalls me. I'm gonna start that sentence again. The fact that some of us academics project our desires and fantasies onto the communities that we work with is a way to preserve our hopes for what we wish to have been the case in the first place. For Freud, having a fetish is not a problem in and of itself. And becoming aware of it does not, at least not automatically, mean that we can operate without it. Instead, an engagement with our fetishes allows us to confront our traumas and opens the door for productive and creative engagement with the objects of our fantasy. For this to happen, however, we must engage in a process that releases the object from the claws of our fetishizing psychic. Such a process would confront the tension between our desire to be like the communities we imagine, while at the same time releasing our own narcissistic need for self-congratulation and the need to distinguish ourselves from the community as a way to justify the hierarchies and the status granted to us as university-based academics. Such a process we might call creative solidarity. In much of my work, particularly over the last 2 years, I have offered a critique of the ways in which the call to solidarity, which with COVID it seems to be everywhere. Everybody's in solidarity with everyone. And the war in Ukraine is just another explosion of solidarity, solidarity. It's a party of solidarity. So over the last 2 years, I have offered a critique of the ways in which the call to solidarity operates as a way to enact a righteous self, and how such calls usually pin the other, the object of solidarity, in place. Many calls to solidarity also express the fetishization of an other who, as the object of my solidarity, must remain fixed, stable in its imagined position, to receive the enactments of the one who claims to be in solidarity. In this case, community-engaged academics. As such, I argue that moving toward creative solidarity requires an unhooking of the self as well as the other, an opening toward another mode of being that releases the other from the claws of my desires. But what does this move toward creative solidarity entail? What kinds of questions does it involve, and how do we teach ourselves to look otherwise, to see the conditions as well as the possibilities inherent in our engagement across community boundaries, and not act as if these were not real? How do we recognize the hooks that keep us all, as well as the communities we work with, in place, and creatively dismantle these social locations in order to be otherwise? Such work requires a pedagogical practice committed to reconfiguring the difference that difference makes in community-engaged practice. This pedagogy of creative solidarity draws insight from the work of Jamaican-American poet June Jordan, who in her essay, Toward a Manifest New Destiny, says, "There is difference, and there is power. And who holds the power decides the meaning of the difference." A pedagogy of creative solidarity is about contesting the ways differences make a difference, and what difference makes, and about wrestling over the power to make a difference and to make difference itself. To start, then, we must ask, when we say community engaged, across what boundaries does that engagement occur? And how did those boundaries come to be? Who are those boundaries protecting? From what? And how does my understanding of community challenge or reinforce those boundaries? These are profoundly pedagogical propositions. And as I have argued elsewhere, solidarity, however you define it, however you use the term, is always pedagogical, in the sense that solidarity, like pedagogy, is always relational and intentional. And as such, solidarity, like pedagogy, is always anchored by a particular ethic or moral orientation. Yet most responses to the call to solidarity, and I would argue to community engagement, sustain existing relational orders, including the hierarchies that condition their relationships and that pin both academics and communities in place. Each are opposite sides of a line that we academics claim to engage. Instead, creative solidarity seeks to unhinge and interrupt those very conditions by engaging creatively and productively across differences to transform the very orders that condition our coming together as communities. And because creative solidarity aims to transform the we, the you and me, the us and them, community-engaged research grounded in creative solidarity must be driven by consent and reciprocity. If community engagement as a form of solidarity begins from the premise of a they, our community to be engaged, and an us, academics committed to community engagement, then it always involves boundaries, and creative solidarity is about a consensual and reciprocal negotiation of those boundaries, and that means change. Change not just for the communities that seek change in order to address oppression, but change for ourselves, for us, the community-engaged researchers that know that community is an unstable idea with porous boundaries, and that acknowledge that we benefit from the very inequalities that communities are struggling against. We, too, must change, not into the likeness of the communities that we imagine, since, after all, they are figments of our fetishizing imagination, but into something else, yet to be created, constructed, and produced not by us, but by the communities themselves. Creative solidarity insists on both the transitive and the reflexive character of solidarity as a verb, which I know is not common in English, but bear with me. And thus, for community engagement to be grounded in creative solidarity, it requires consent. But it doesn't mean consent in the transactional, legalistic way in which research ethics boards frame consent. Rather, I mean that unless those communities that we claim to engage have explicitly, deliberately, actively, in an ongoing and perhaps even enthusiastic manner, agree to be engaged with us, then we risk falling back on the trap of the fetish. This is because a lack of ongoing, deliberate, active, explicit, and enthusiastic consent raises the risk that we may take consent for granted, as if consent was permanent and irrevocable. When we do this, we fail to recognize when consent has in fact been revoked, and yet we act as if. I want to clarify that this attention to consent does not mean or require that those of us who engage communities be positioned in equal footing within hierarchies, or that we agree to some sense of sameness in any concrete way. This, of course, is a complete chimera. It's a fantasy. And approaching our work as if that were possible is once again projecting a fantasy onto communities. Because creative solidarity seeks to transform the conditions that structure inequality and define the difference that difference makes, again, drawing on June Jordan's insight. Reciprocity and consent are always negotiated, with an understanding that power hierarchies are always already in play, and that by naming and recognizing them, we begin a process also of destabilizing and transforming them, of challenging the power that determines what differences make a difference and what difference makes. This means that rather than acting as if power has not always already mediating our engagement with communities, and even their ability to give consent to engaging with us in the first place, we in fact work hard to make the operations of power, or what organizational sociologist Dane Acker calls inequality regimes, visible. Moving into the space of creative solidarity means moving towards a way of engaging each other that acknowledges norms in order to achieve a contingent coherence, while also resisting and subverting the rules that regulate our coming together. I mean a solidarity that operates under the assumption that we, academics, as well as the communities that we engage, are incomplete in the process of becoming. Not a solidarity that assumes commonness or sameness, but one that assumes difference. Not a solidarity that builds boundaries to protect resources, but one that enters the space between boundaries. Not a solidarity that stands on the notion that a core identity will be retained, that we are pinned to who we are or who others think we should be, but rather one that assumes that identity is not only in flux, but that it is an impression, maybe a delusion, a temporary lap from which to view the world. Yet also a present from which to view the past and invent a future, our futurity. To think with futurity, as my colleague and co-author Sarah Switzer, who's thankfully here with us, and I argue in the chapter that we wrote for the conference, to think with futurity is not simply to think about the future. To think about the future is to accept the terms of the present moment, which delimit what kinds of future is imaginable. Because present conditions delimit who gets to imagine a future, whether and how the future is imagined, and what futures are imaginable. To think with futurity is to disrupt the politics of the present and to expand, in the words of Arjuna Padurai, our capacity to aspire. Reaching toward futurity requires a critical awareness of the past in the present. This community futurity is not the future of the university. Futurity is the power of creation in the present. Thinking with futurity realigns the terms by which futures are imagined and constructed. It calls out the fetish as well as the fetishizing subject and says to them, to us, this is not about you. Rather, it is about Black, Indigenous, and Brown futurities that must be centered in community-engaged research. Lest we remain stuck in the fetishizing mind of the academic industrial complex we call the university. As a community-engaged researcher, reaching towards futurity means we must join the undercommon, an inner resistance that might create another university, one that might be possible precisely because of the contestations that have always been part of knowledge-making and transformation. It means we must recognize the porosity of institutional boundaries so that we can create alternative spaces inside, outside, and in between existing institutions. Perhaps this means that the future of community-engaged research is always marginal. And perhaps when we, community-engaged researchers, make ourselves obsolete or unnecessary for communities to thrive, is precisely the moment that we succeeded. Black, Indigenous, and Brown futurities are the vanishing point, the point at which the fictional lines meet and collide. The past and the future in the present as lived, not as imagined, not as the fetish against which we project desires, but as life itself, in all its dynamism, in all its messiness, in all its survivance. This work toward futurity wrestles with the power to make a difference and to decide what difference makes a difference, inventing new differences, playing with the meanings that make a difference, and reclaiming the power to desire and to fantasize, to have our own fetish. Through creative solidarity, it is the university that becomes the fetish, the source of the materials, real and symbolic, with which we communities play. The switch of the power hierarchy is the terrain of the future in the present, the sandbox in which we can play with new configurations. It requires creative and even mischievous approaches to navigating universities as institutions. Collaborative budgeting that deliberately breaks rules, decision-making processes that undermine authority and reoccupy the space that has been stolen. Acting as if the university mattered, while undermining how it matters at every turn. We love universities, or so they might think. Thank you.
Rubén, we talked about an aftermath.
That's right.
And as opposed to a Q&A, which is very common in this moment, our time's a little tight.
Yes. No.
And given that we are, there are so many things to say, I have to say after which was fantastic. I know this wasn't in our plan, but would you be open to a few questions just before we break?
I think, yeah, I think what I would prefer is to just have a moment to just kind of let some of that sit for a second, if that's okay. Maybe just 30 seconds. And maybe invite your neighbor, maybe you know the person next to you, and just sort of maybe like, what the hell, whatever.
Have a few words.
Have a few words. And then maybe instead of playing the sage on the stage thing, you can perhaps pose a series of questions that we can then address in conversation at a later point, or maybe I'll try to pull some strings together if I can from my sleeve. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Maybe what we could do is those after, we'll take a minute, that's okay, and folks can turn to their neighbor. And then the ideas that come out, I think it would be fantastic as we're at the beginning, that these then become thematic threads that we can return to, because Rubén's going to return on the plenary to close the conference along with other keynotes. And so there'll be an opportunity to return to some of these threads in relation to what you've seen and experienced. So how does that sound?
Yeah, I think so. And that way we don't have to sort of play the stage thing.
I just want to add something. I'm part of
Fabulous, yeah.
Their questions, if you want to capture something that's really rich, because then we can all talk to each other at the conference, and then it can get captured there and revisited later. Just a plug for that.
Okay, Tara, that's a fantastic idea, and I'm going to switch things up because I'm also conscious of our time, and we're a little bit over our time, and so here's what I'd like to suggest. We actually have a moment now where there's a few things to wrap up on, and then we're going to have an opportunity to gather outside at a reception. There's some food and drinks for folks, and as Tara has really, another one of our fantastic organizing team members, Tara, I had no idea we were going to introduce each other this way, but it's a great way to do it. The Whova app becomes a great place to both lay out thoughts now, but also as the evening unfolds, to add to that. And those will be elements that we can bring back to the end, and that will allow a kind of dialogic element of our work to unfold rather than the sage on the stage, which I think is rightly rejected. So let me say now just a tremendous thank you to Rubén for that provocation to get us underway. That was a remarkable build on what Dr. Christian, Dorothy shared with us. And I feel like we have now been provoked and opened, where our job is, at least in part over the next 3 days, to use our time together to provoke the institution and to reimagine the boundaries that are part of how we're working together. To take the fetish that is community and redirect that towards the university, in fact, which I think opens up a fundamentally different way of parsing the power relationships that are part of our work. It's now, as we pull this part of our program to an end, to thank Dorothy, to thank Jeff, to thank Rubén for opening and beginning our conversations. A number of ideas are now before us. Some reminders. As we pull this session to a close, there are drinks available outside. Everyone will have drink tickets in the lovely envelopes that were shared with you at registration. We hope you'll stay with us for an hour and visit before perhaps heading off to a more fulsome meal. Some things to address as we move. Please remember the zine provides the program at a glance. I want to mention again, because I haven't really said enough, but amongst other things in the Whova app are a space to share photos, a space to share commentary, a space to meet each other and reach out to each other. There's a lot of resources on there that will allow you to dig into the conference in a more robust way. So I really encourage you to use that. And much thanks to our team for the work of designing that and populating it with material. Remind everyone again about the Wi-Fi, and if you have any issues around the Wi-Fi, please reach out to Alicia or to myself or to Am, and we will work to solve those problems. Some other things, a reminder again about the hashtag SFU Horizons 2022. The plenary tomorrow. Our plenary tomorrow gets underway at 8:30. And we have light breakfast and coffee that will be served at 8 o'clock. So come down hungry and wanting coffee and tea and other drinks to get your morning started. And we will help you out with that. We have a wonderful opening plenary and then a series of parallel sessions tomorrow. So it's going to be a full and rich day. And we look forward to seeing many of you there. I think, Am, anything else that you wanted to say? Okay. Indeed, there's a reception outside, and we would love to welcome you all out there. And again, our thanks to our opening speakers. And we'll see you all in the morning, and sooner, actually.